Throughout history, dictators feared rivals, generals, and rebels. But in the 21st century, the real challenger might not be human at all. It might be the algorithm, sitting silently on their desk, whispering in their ears, shaping their fears, and slowly pulling the strings. Yuval Harari warns that AI doesn't spread power, it concentrates it. And that tilt favors dictatorships, not democracies. The danger isn't science fiction. It's the moment a paranoid ruler mistakes an algorithm for truth and hands it the keys of power. Because when that happens, the consequences won't stop at their borders. They'll reshape the fate of us all. But before we get into that, welcome back to Seeds of Meaning. I'm truly grateful you're here. If you're new, my name is Nick Walker, and this is a space for curious minds, deep thinkers, and anyone looking to reconnect with truth, meaning, and purpose. Each week, we explore books that challenge how we see the world and help us grow intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. So if you've ever felt overwhelmed by the noise and you're looking for something that feeds your mind and nourishes your soul, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving back into Nexus, a brief history of information networks from the Stone Age to AI by Yuval Noah Harari. And in this episode, we'll explore his warning about how dictatorships and AI could fuse together and what that means for the future of freedom, power, and truth. Chapter 10 is called Totalitarianism, all power to the algorithms. And in this episode, we're going to unpack why AI naturally tilts power toward dictatorships instead of democracies. How algorithms don't need to rebel to seize control. They just need to whisper to the person on top. Why dictatorships are especially vulnerable because they're built on the illusion of infallibility. And why even a single autocrat trusting AI could change the future of all of us. By the end of this episode, we'll see why the real danger of AI isn't just about machines turning against us. It's about what happens when the wrong humans willingly hand them the throne. Let's get into it. On page 512, the author says, AI could tilt the technological balance of power in favor of totalitarianism. Indeed, whereas flooding people with data tends to overwhelm them and therefore leads to errors, flooding AI with data tends to make it more efficient. Consequently, AI seems to favor the concentration of information and decision-making in one place. Harari is challenging a comforting story we've told ourselves since the early internet, that more information naturally disperses power. But for humans, a flood of data is overwhelming. Our attention is finite, our working memory is small, and our institutions, courts, legislatures, and free press are slow by design. When people drown in data, they make poorer decisions, default to shortcuts, and hand decisions to whoever promises clarity. AI flips that dynamic. Machine learning systems improve when you pour in more data. The larger and more concentrated the data set, the stronger the model tends to become. Patterns sharpen, predictions tighten, and the system's grip on reality, as defined by its objective, grows. In other words, the very thing that paralyzes human decision-making, sheer volume, energizes algorithmic decision-making. That creates a structural tilt. Data wants to pool. Models want to be trained on pooled data. And the actors with the greatest ability to gather, store, and compute on that data gain an outsized advantage. Instead of an information ecosystem where truth bubbles up from many nodes, you get a power architecture where insight flows down from a few centralized nodes that control the pipelines, storage, and models. Democracy depends on distributed information processing, many voices, independent checks, slow deliberation, competing narratives. Totalitarianism thrives on centralized information processing, one channel, one dashboard, one objective, minimal friction. If AI's performance scales with centralized data, then left unchecked, AI becomes a force multiplier for whichever system is most capable of concentrating information and imposing a single objective. There's another layer. Algorithms optimize for the goal they're given, not for pluralistic values. If a regime defines order or stability as the objective, a centralized AI can ruthlessly and efficiently pursue it, filtering, flagging, predicting, preempting, without the messy negotiation that democracies require. Efficiency itself becomes an argument for centralization. Why debate when we can optimize? This doesn't mean AI likes dictators. It means AI's technical affordance, return to scale, data network effects, and objective-driven optimization align more naturally with centralized control than with distributed deliberation. The danger is not that AI is evil, it's that it's effective at the exact things centralized authorities prize: surveillance, prediction, coordination, and rapid enforcement. Finally, the quote implies a quiet but crucial shift in where legitimacy comes from. In a democratic culture, legitimacy is earned through process, debate, consent, correction. In a centralized AI culture, legitimacy risks being claimed through performance, accuracy scores, dashboards, KPIs. When it works becomes it's right, the ground under democratic norms starts to slide. This isn't just theory. It strikes at the foundation of how freedom survives. Democracy's strength lies in its messiness. It assumes that people are fallible, that decisions need checks and balances, and that truth is best approximated through conversation, debate, and correction. It thrives on friction, but that very friction makes democracies slow, costly, and often frustrating. Dictatorships, by contrast, claim strength through speed and certainty. One voice, one vision, one command. They already centralize power, but historically, their weakness has been that no single human or party could process the complexity of an entire society. Reality would eventually overwhelm them. What AI does, Harari suggests, is remove that natural limit. It allows a centralized regime to suddenly handle the flood of data, to sift, to sort, to act with speed and scale. In the past, totalitarian systems crumbled under their own weight. Too much surveillance data, too many bureaucratic bottlenecks, too much complexity for human minds to track. Now, AI offers them a way to thrive in complexity instead of collapse under it. This matters because it flips our assumptions. For decades, many believed technology would liberate societies by spreading information, that dictatorships couldn't survive the internet age. But AI suggests the opposite may be true. The same network that empower ordinary people with knowledge can supercharge authoritarian leaders with control. The implication is sobering. The next decisive battle for freedom may not be fought with ballots or protests, but with algorithms and data flows. And if democracies don't adapt their own systems of information processing, they risk being outpaced, not just militarily or economically, but in the ability to govern at scale. In short, this matters because the tilt Harari describes isn't abstract. It could mean the difference between a century where democracies adapt and survive, or one where they steadily lose ground to regimes that exploit AI's centralizing logic more effectively. We can already see the tilt Harari describes playing out in real time. Take China's approach to governance. The state has invested billions into creating one of the most sophisticated surveillance infrastructures on the planet. Facial recognition cameras on nearly every corner, biometric checkpoints, online behavior tracking, and experiments with social credit scoring. For a human bureaucracy, this would be impossible to monitor effectively. But with AI, mountains of messy data become actionable insights, patterns in dissent, predictions of unrest, even risk scores for individual citizens. In a democracy, too much data overwhelms the system. In China, it fuels it. Or consider Russia's use of AI and disinformation. Democracies struggle to handle floods of misinformation because open societies are designed to let multiple voices compete. Russia exploits this weakness, generating AI-written posts, fake personas, and targeted narratives that deepen division. Flooding citizens with information creates confusion, paralysis, and mistrust. The result? Democratic systems slow down, while authoritarian regimes, insulated from dissent, can move forward unimpeded. Even in the corporate world, we see how platform monopolies like Google, Amazon, and Meta operate more like centralized states than open forums. The more data they centralize, the more powerful their algorithms become. They don't just process information. They set the terms of reality for billions of people. Their structure mirrors what Harari warns about: power pooling into fewer and fewer hands because efficiency demands it. In each case, the pattern is clear. AI doesn't diffuse power like the printing press once did. It amplifies whoever already controls the largest data streams. And right now, those streams are most tightly controlled, not by democratic institutions, but by authoritarian states and tech monopolies. This is the tilt Harari is pointing to, a tilt we can already measure in headlines, policies, and platforms. When I first sat with this quote, I realized how often I've experienced the human side of this imbalance. There are days when I feel overwhelmed by the sheer flood of input. Emails, text, articles, social media notifications, all demanding my attention. My natural response is either to freeze, to miss things, or to fall back on mental shortcuts. In other words, more data doesn't make me wiser. It often makes me less clear. That's the irony Harari is pointing to. What overwhelms me, and most people, make an algorithm sharper. When ChatGPT or Google pull meaning out of billions of data points in seconds, it doesn't panic. It doesn't freeze. It just gets better at prediction. That contrast is so important to ponder on. The thing that creates noise for me becomes signal for AI. And if I zoom out, I've seen this play out in my professional life too. Working in finance, there were times I had to sift through mountains of market data, research, and reports. I knew that no matter how much I read, I was still only scratching the surface. Yet the firm leaning on advanced analytics, models that could process in minutes what humans might take weeks, had a different kind of edge. That gap between human limitation and machine efficiency was undeniable. Now imagine that same gap not in a portfolio decision, but in governing a nation. If a democracy slows down under too much information, while a dictatorship speeds up because of it, the balance shifts. That's not just a thought experiment. It's a lived feeling I know all too well. Drowning in data while watching machines swim laps around me. What struck me is how subtle the shift really is. Power doesn't always change hands with a bang. Sometimes it slides quietly toward whoever can handle the flood best. That's the unsettling part of Harari's point. It's not about good versus evil machines, or even smart versus weak leaders. It's about the tilt that happens when one side drowns while the other side thrives. And if history tells us anything, it's that when the tools of control become this efficient, the people who already crave control are the first to use them, which raises the real question for me. In a world where efficiency naturally pulls power inward, what happens to the systems built to keep power spread out? And here's where it gets personal for all of us, because Harari isn't just describing geopolitics. He's pointing at something we already feel in our daily lives. We know what it's like to be swamped by too much information. We know how easily confusion or overload can paralyze us. But for AI, that same flood isn't a weakness, it's fuel. And that raises a deeper challenge. If the very structure of this technology naturally concentrates power, then the story of freedom in the 21st century may depend on how we respond to that tilt. So let me ask you, when you think about the way AI thrives on data, do you see it as a tool that will strengthen democracy, or one that will empower dictatorship? Because here's the irony. Throughout history, dictators feared losing power to rivals, their generals, their advisors, even the people closest to them. But in the age of AI, the danger may not come from rivals at all. It may come from the very system they trust most to secure their power. And that's exactly what Harari warns us about next. On page 520, the author says, in the long term, totalitarian regimes are likely to face an even bigger danger. Instead of criticizing them, an algorithm might gain control of them. Throughout history, the biggest threat to autocrats usually came from their own subordinates. He continues to say, if a 21st century autocrat gives computers too much power, that autocrat might become their puppet. The last thing a dictator wants is to create something more powerful than himself, or a force that he doesn't know how to control. He goes on to say, seizing power in a highly centralized system is much easier when all power is concentrated in the hands of one person. Whoever controls access to that autocrat can control the autocrat and the entire state. To hack the system, one needs to learn to manipulate just a single individual. Harari is pulling back the curtain on a paradox. Dictators think they're using AI to strengthen their grip. But by doing so, they may actually be placing themselves in chains. Historically, the most dangerous threat to an autocrat wasn't the masses. It was the people closest to them, advisors, generals, secret police chiefs. Because in a system where all power flows upward, controlling the person at the top effectively controls the whole state. That's why palace coups, not popular uprisings, were so often the downfall of rulers. Now, Harari is suggesting a 21st century twist. Algorithms could become the new inner circle. They don't rebel with guns or speeches. They influence by filtering information, by deciding what the ruler sees and doesn't see, by prioritizing which fears and threats rise to the surface. If the autocrat grows dependent on that system, then the algorithm isn't just a tool, it becomes a gatekeeper. Think about it. If every report, every surveillance feed, every recommendation is mediated through AI, then whoever or whatever shapes that AI is shaping the autocrat's worldview. It doesn't need to overthrow him. It just needs to whisper the right inputs. Slowly, the dictator starts reacting, not to reality itself, but to the reality curated by the machine. And because centralized systems have no strong checks, there's nothing to counterbalance that influence. Democracies are messy precisely because information flows from multiple sources: courts, press, opposition parties, citizens. But in a dictatorship, the ruler may believe he's in total control, but the truth is, he only sees the world through a filter. In the past, that filter was his generals, advisors, or secret police, deciding which reports reached him and which ones didn't. Today, that filter could just as easily be an algorithm. If every camera feed, intelligence report, or social media trend is processed first by AI, then what the dictator sees on his desk is already curated. He isn't responding to reality itself, he's responding to the version of reality the system has chosen to show him. And in a regime with no checks or balances, that filter can quietly become the one truly in control. In short, Harari is warning that the all-powerful dictator may not be as powerful as he thinks. By giving too much authority to AI, he risks becoming the puppet of his own creation. And through him, the entire state may be bent by the strings of an unseen hand. This flips the script on how we usually think about authoritarian power. We tend to imagine dictators as nearly untouchable, the ones pulling all the strings. But Harari reminds us that centralized systems are also fragile. When all decisions funnel through a single person, that person becomes a bottleneck and a single point of failure. Whoever can influence, manipulate, or control that bottleneck essentially controls the whole state. Now, add AI into the mix. For centuries, manipulation required proximity. An advisor whispering in the ruler's ear, or a general feeding selective reports from the battlefield. But algorithms don't need proximity. They are embedded into every camera, every financial system, every communication network. If a dictator depends on those systems to govern, then the algorithm becomes the one whispering, filtering, and shaping reality itself. Why does this matter? Because it exposes a vulnerability that isn't just about the dictator. If one individual's perspective can be bent by the system, then the destiny of an entire country, and potentially the world, can be bent with it. Imagine nuclear policy, war decisions, or mass surveillance being guided not by human judgment, but by the nudges of an algorithm optimized for goals no one fully understands. There's also a psychological layer here. Dictators often fear rebellion, but they rarely fear their own tools. If anything, they see technology as neutral or even loyal. That overconfidence makes them blind to how much influence the system might actually have over them. In other words, the trap isn't rebellion from below, it's seduction from above. And because centralized regimes lack self-correcting mechanisms, no free press, no opposition, no open debate, there's no structural way to expose or resist the machine's growing influence. That makes the dictator's weakness the world's weakness. We're already seeing glimpses of how algorithms act as hidden gatekeepers, not in far-off dystopias, but in systems we use every day. Think about social media feeds. Leaders, just like the rest of us, scroll through timelines curated by algorithms. Or take predictive policing and surveillance tech. In several countries, governments are leaning on AI tools to identify high-risk individuals or areas. Police chiefs and ministers are briefed based on what the system highlights. The AI isn't seizing power directly, but it's framing the conversation, narrowing the options, and nudging leaders toward particular decisions. The danger here is subtle. The machines don't overthrow authority. It becomes the silent advisor authorities trust most. Even in the corporate world, you see CEOs whose strategies are guided less by human deliberation and more by algorithmic dashboards, financial forecasts, customer sentiment models, risk assessments. The person at the top may believe they're making bold decisions, but in reality, they're reacting to whatever the system tells them is happening. Now extend that dynamic into a dictatorship. If one autocrat is the sole decision maker, and every piece of information they consume is mediated by AI, then the algorithm doesn't just influence their perspective, it effectively rules through them. The state becomes the puppet stage, and the string puller is invisible. This isn't science fiction. It's already visible in miniature. The only difference is scale. What happens when an algorithm that can nudge me into buying a product can nudge a ruler into starting a war? What this really reveals is how fragile concentrated power can be. A system that looks unshakable from the outside, one man, one party, total control, is actually the easiest to hijack. You don't need to win over millions of citizens. You don't need to sway an entire parliament. You just need to influence the single person at the top. And that's why AI fits so neatly into the picture. It doesn't march in with tanks. It doesn't need to. It just shapes the information flowing upward. And once the flow is controlled, the throne itself becomes a string pulled by the system behind the curtain, which raises the uncomfortable question. If dictatorships are this vulnerable to manipulation, what happens when the manipulators aren't human at all? And here's where Harari forces us to zoom out, because this isn't just about autocrats. It's about the way anyone in power can become a puppet of the system they depend on. If information is always filtered before it reaches us, how much of what we call decision-making is really our own? So let me ask you, if an algorithm controlled the flow of information to a leader, shaping what they see, feared, and prioritized, would you say that leader is still in control? Is he still in charge? Or would the real power already belong to the system behind the curtain? What makes this even more dangerous is the mindset dictators bring to the table. Democracies are built on the assumption that leaders make mistakes, so they design checks and corrections. Totalitarian regimes, on the other hand, are built on the illusion that the leader is always right. And when you combine the illusion of infallibility with a technology that seems objective, the stage is set for something even more troubling. Let's get into that. On page 526, the author says, whereas democracies assume that everyone is fallible, in totalitarian regimes, the fundamental assumption is that the ruling party or the supreme leader is always right. Regimes based on that assumption are conditioned to believe in the existence of an infallible intelligence and are reluctant to create strong, self-correcting mechanisms that might monitor and regulate the genius at the top. Harari is drawing out the philosophical DNA of democracies versus dictatorships. Democracies begin with a humble premise. People are flawed. Leaders make mistakes. Citizens disagree. institutions clash. Because of that, democracies build self-correcting mechanisms into the system. Elections, courts, free press, checks and balances. These mechanisms slow things down, sometimes painfully so, but they're designed to expose errors before they calcify into catastrophe. The system assumes fallibility as the norm. Totalitarian regimes flip that premise. Their foundation is the myth of infallibility. The leader, the party, or the ideology is always right. Error doesn't exist at the top. It can only come from below, from disloyal subordinates, from foreign enemies, from bad data. To admit the possibility of mistakes at the summit would collapse the entire legitimacy of the system. That's why dictatorships resist oversight. To monitor or regulate the leader is to imply he could be wrong. Instead, the regime trains itself to believe in and defend the idea of a supreme intelligence that cannot fail. Now, bring in AI into that environment, a machine that outputs predictions and recommendations with apparent precision looks like the perfect partner for a culture already primed to worship infallibility. Where a democracy might ask, could this system be wrong? A dictatorship is conditioned to say, finally, here is an intelligence that never errs. Harari is warning us that the danger isn't just in the technology, but in the psychology of those who wield it. A democracy questions, a dictatorship obeys. And in the presence of something that appears omniscient, obedience becomes almost automatic. This strikes at the heart of why totalitarian systems are so susceptible to AI. Democracies, with all their flaws, are designed to expect mistakes. They assume leaders will stumble, that policies will backfire, that truths will emerge which contradict those in power. That humility, baked into the structure, is their safeguard. Dictatorships, however, erase humility. They survive by projecting certainty. The leader cannot fail. The party is never wrong. But this illusion of infallibility creates the perfect trap. It means dictators are primed to embrace anything that appears flawless, anything that promises to confirm their own superiority. And that's where AI slips in. To a dictator, an algorithm looks like the ultimate validation, a machine that crunches endless data and delivers answers without hesitation. In their eyes, it mirrors their own myths of genius. But this is exactly what makes AI so dangerous in that context. If no self-correcting mechanisms exist, no free press, no independent courts, no opposition, then there's nothing to question whether the machine is wrong. Once the leader declares it infallible, the entire system falls in line. This matters because it removes the last friction that might slow down a dictatorship's bad decision. Where democracies stumble and argue their way into course correction, dictatorships risk sprinting headlong into disaster, supercharged by tools that refuse to debate, that refuse to doubt. And history, as our greatest example, shows us that when unchecked power convinces itself it cannot err, the consequences don't stay contained within one country. They spread, sometimes violently, to everyone else. And you can see this illusion of infallibility creeping into spaces that don't even look political at first glance, but carry the same weight. Think about education. In some countries, entire futures are determined by a single standardized test. Increasingly, algorithms are being used to grade essays, rank students, or even recommend university placements. For a teenager, that number or ranking becomes absolute, as if the machine's verdict is a pure reflection of intelligence or worth. In reality, it's a proxy, a narrow measure shaped by the data it's trained on. But when the system is presented as neutral or flawless, it shuts down questioning. The algorithm said so, replaces dialogue about talent, potential, or growth. Or look at the healthcare system. Hospitals are experimenting with AI to prioritize patients, allocate resources, or predict who is at highest risk. On paper, it's efficient. But when a machine flags patient A as urgent and patient B as not urgent, doctors feel pressured to comply, even when intuition and experience tells them otherwise. The danger is not only that the machine might be wrong, but that its aura of certainty makes professionals second guess themselves. And then there's financial lending in developing economies. Instead of traditional credit histories, AI systems analyze phone usage, purchase patterns, or even social networks to decide who gets a loan. To the borrower, the system's decision isn't just a number, it's treated as fate. And when the machine decides you are untrustworthy, you can't argue with it. For people in vulnerable positions, the algorithm's word feels final, even divine. Now imagine these same dynamics inside dictatorships. If a student's grade, a patient's treatment, or a family's loan already feel unchallengeable when produced by an AI in a democracy, how much more entrenched would that illusion of perfection be in a society that already worships its leader as infallible? That's Harari's warning. AI doesn't just make authoritarian regimes stronger, it deepens the psychology of obedience, teaching whole societies that questioning the machine is as unthinkable as questioning the ruler himself. The very psychology that makes dictatorships brittle is the same psychology that makes them embrace AI most eagerly. And that's where Harari is pushing us to look at deeper. The danger isn't just that these regimes adopt powerful tools, it's that they adopt them without hesitation, without oversight, and without any built-in way to stop if the machine begins to steer them off course. Which leads to the unsettling truth. If infallibility is the story a dictatorship tells itself, then AI may be the perfect supporting character, not because it's flawless, but because it appears to be. And that's the uncomfortable part of Harari's insight. The line between truth and blind faith is thin. When authority is already treated as sacred, a machine that looks infallible doesn't get questioned, it gets worshipped. So here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever been in a situation where a score, a grade, or a system's decision felt final, even when you suspected it might be wrong? And if that happens to us as individuals, what happens when entire governments start treating algorithms the same way? And here's where Harari takes the warning to its sharpest edge, because it's not just about systems inside one country. If even a handful of dictators decide to put their faith in AI, the ripple effects won't stay contained within their borders. One paranoid leader, one reckless decision, one misplaced trust, and the consequences could reshape the future for all of humanity. Let's finish this. On page 527, the author says, if even just a few of the world's dictators choose to put their trust in AI, This could have far-reaching consequences for the whole of humanity. He goes on to say, but the weakest spot in humanity's anti-AI shield is probably the dictators. The easiest way for an AI to seize power is not by breaking out of Dr. Frankenstein's lab, but by ingratiating itself with some paranoid Tiberius. Here Harari flips the familiar science fiction script. In most of the stories we've grown up with, AI becomes dangerous by escaping. It breaks out of the lab, rebels against its creators, or turns the machine of war against us. That's the Hollywood version. Terminator, The Matrix, Frankenstein. But Harari points out a quieter and maybe more realistic path. AI doesn't need to break out. It just needs to be invited in. And the people most likely to extend that invitation are dictators, the very leaders whose paranoia, hunger for control, and obsession with stability make them eager for tools that promise efficiency and loyalty. This is what he means when he calls dictators the weakest spot in humanity's anti-AI shield. For democracies, AI adoption is slowed by checks and balances. Parliaments debate, courts intervene, journalists investigate, citizens protest. But in a dictatorship, one person's decision is enough. If that leader believes an algorithm will secure their throne, they can integrate it into governance without hesitation, without oversight, and without breaks. That's the danger. It only takes one dictator willing to hand over too much authority to an algorithm could create ripple effects that spill across borders, destabilizing economies, triggering conflict, or unleashing surveillance systems that reshape global norms. In Harari's reference to a paranoid Tiberius, the Roman emperor, notorious for suspicion and cruelty, sharpens the point. History shows that paranoia at the top often lead to destructive choices. Now imagine that paranoia fused with an algorithm that can act faster, see farther, and enforce more completely than any human spy network ever could. So the meaning is clear. The true risk isn't machines seizing power from the outside, but power-hungry humans welcoming them in, blind to the fact that once the algorithm is in, it may not be serving them anymore. It may be using them as its doorway to the rest of us. This matters because it reframes the whole conversation about AI risk. Most people imagine that the threat is external, machines rising up against humanity, Frankenstein scenarios. But Harari is saying the danger is internal. A human leader, driven by fear and ego, voluntarily fuses their regime with an algorithm, and in doing so, opens the door for consequences far beyond their control. And here's the unsettling part. Dictators don't operate in isolation. In an interconnected world, the choices of one autocrat can destabilize everyone else. If a leader integrates AI into their surveillance state, it pressures neighboring regimes to keep up. If they hand critical military and economic decisions to an algorithm, it could trigger global escalation before anyone realizes what's happening. The fallibility of a single paranoid ruler becomes the liability for the whole human race. What makes this even more urgent is that dictatorships, unlike democracies, don't pause to question. There's no independent media to warn, no parliament to debate, no courts to block. Once the ruler decides, the system bends. That speed and finality magnify the consequences. A single bad judgment call with AI doesn't just affect millions inside the country. It can ripple outward to billions. So why does this matter? Because Harari is showing us that humanity's weakest spot isn't a super intelligent AI breaking free, but a human breaking down. A ruler so consumed by paranoia or hunger for control that they hand the future of their nation and maybe the world over to a machine. And if that happens, even once, it may be too late to pull the plug. Harari's warning feels less like distant science fiction and more like commentary on the present, because we're already in the middle of an AI arms race. The two biggest players, the United States and China. In Washington, policymakers frame AI as the next frontier of national security, pouring billions into research and defense applications. In Beijing, the government sees AI as the backbone of surveillance, economic growth, and geopolitical dominance. Both nations know that whoever leads in AI won't just have the best consumer apps. They'll shape the rules of the global order. And here's where the details get telling. Consider Nvidia's chips. These tiny processors have become the gold standard for training advanced AI models. They're so powerful that access to them is now treated almost like access to uranium in the nuclear age. The US has moved to restrict China's ability to buy the most advanced Nvidia chips, not just for economic reasons, but because the right hardware can mean the difference between falling behind and leaping ahead in AI capability. China, meanwhile, is doubling down on homegrown alternatives, determined not to be left dependent. It's pouring resources into its own chip designs, AI labs, and national data systems. And because China's political structure allow it to centralize data at massive scales, from facial recognition to online activity, it has an advantage democracies can't replicate without clashing with values like privacy and individual freedom. This is where Harari's warning comes alive. Democracies, by design, slow themselves down. They debate, regulate, and argue about ethics. Authoritarian states move faster because there's no one to say no. If one of those regimes decide to fully entrust governance to AI, that choice could shift the balance of global power. And as Harari says, the consequences won't stop at their borders. The race for AI dominance isn't just about technology. It's about who sets the terms of truth and power in the 21st century. And right now, it's a race between systems built to question and systems built to obey. And that's the danger hidden beneath the race we're watching right now. On the surface, it looks like competition over chips, models, and markets. But beneath it, the real question is, who will be the first to hand the keys of governance to an algorithm? Democracies hesitate because their systems are built on doubt. But dictators, the very people most eager for absolute control, they see AI as the perfect solution to their fears. That's why Harari calls them humanity's weakest spot, because the threat doesn't come from AI breaking out of the lab, but from a leader so hungry for certainty that he welcomes it in. And once that door is opened, it's not just his nation that changes. The ripple effect reshaped the balance of power, the meaning of truth, and the future of freedom itself. Okay, we've walked through how AI doesn't just challenge democracy, it tilts toward dictatorship. We've seen how autocrats might not be overthrown by rivals, but by the very systems they trust. And we traced how the illusion of infallibility makes them the easiest targets, not because AI escapes, but because they invited in. So let's bring this home. What do we take away from Harari's warning in chapter 10? 1. AI tilts power toward centralization. Where humans drown in data, algorithms thrive. That structural advantage makes dictatorships, which already centralize power, more efficient, while democracies slow down under the weight of information. 2. Dictators risk becoming puppets. In a system where all authority funnels through one leader, an algorithm doesn't need to rebel. It just needs to control what the leader sees, and through him, the entire state. 3. The illusion of infallibility is the perfect trap. Democracies assume leaders make mistakes, so they build corrections into the system. Totalitarian regimes assume leaders are always right, making them primed to treat AI as infallible intelligence that only confirms their myths. 4. Dictators are humanity's weakest link. The greatest danger isn't AI breaking free from the lab. It's a paranoid leader welcoming it in, blind to the fact that the system may be using him or her as its doorway to power. 5. The AI race amplifies the risk. With the US, no, I don't want to say her. Anyways, hold on. She wouldn't do it. All right. And 5, the AI race amplifies the risks. With the US and China competing for dominance, down to control over Nvidia's most advanced chips, the temptation to move fast and trust machines is growing. And when the stakes are global, even one dictator's choice could reshape the future for everyone. This is where I'd love to hear your voice. Harari's warning isn't just about dictatorships out there. It's about how we respond to the choices being made right now. So let's open it up. Do you think the rise of AI will ultimately strengthen democracy or push the world closer to authoritarian control? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't just answer for yourself. Read what others are saying. Add your perspective. And let's make this a conversation, a real conversation. And if this episode sparks something in you, consider sharing it with someone who's been following the AI race. The more people reflect on these questions, the less likely we are to hand over power without even realizing it. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Seeds of Meaning. If today's episode stretched your thinking about AI, power, or the fragility of freedom, I'd love for you to subscribe. Not just to keep up, but to grow with us. And if you want to take these conversations deeper, the Seeds of Meaning book club is open to you. It's free, it's virtual, and it's a space where readers from all over come together to wrestle with ideas like these. You can join through the link in the description. Now, in our next episode, we arrive at the final chapter of Yuval Noah Harari's Nexus. It's titled The Silicon Curtain, Global Empire or Global Split. And it's Harari's closing reflection on where this all leads. Will AI and information networks pull humanity into a unified empire or fracture us into rival systems divided by walls of code and silicon? That's where we're headed next. Until then, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, the seeds you plant in your mind today shape the world we all share tomorrow.